The silver ignition key felt like a sliver of ice against my thumb as I prepared to turn it, unaware that I was a single mechanical click away from being incinerated in a ball of gasoline and glass. The morning air in Seattle was thick with a persistent, bone-chilling mist that clung to the windshield of my sedan like a damp shroud obscuring the world beyond my driveway. I was already running late for the meeting that would decide the fate of my late husband's estate. My heart heavy with a grief that felt more like a physical weight than an emotion. Arthur had been gone for only a month, and the silence he left behind was a deafening roar that followed me into every room of our Victorian home. Just as my fingers tightened around the key, a violent thud against the driver's side window sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my veins, causing me to gasp as I turned to see a specter of the streets. It was Barnaby, a man the neighborhood called the Watcher, his face a roadmap of hardship, and his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic urgency that bypassed all social decorum. He was screaming something, his palms slapping against the glass with a rhythm of desperation, leaving streaks of grime that seemed to form a frantic code I couldn't yet decipher. He shrieked for me not to start the engine, his voice cracking like dry timber under the weight of a secret that was too heavy for his weary soul to carry alone. I rolled the window down just an inch, the scent of rain and old wood smoke drifting in, and he leaned in close enough for me to see the terror reflected in his bloodshot eyes as he whispered that my daughter-in-law had been there in the dead of night. My breath hitched in my throat, the very oxygen in the car seeming to vanish as Barnaby described a scene that felt like a fever dream. He spoke of Isabella, the woman my son Caleb had married 3 years ago, arriving under the cover of a moonless sky, with a tall man in a tailored suit who carried himself with the cold precision of a surgeon. They had opened the hood of my car with a practiced ease, their movements synchronized and silent, while Isabella held a flashlight that cut through the darkness like a blade. Barnaby, hidden in the shadows of the overgrown hedge, where he often sought refuge from the wind, had watched them work with a small, heavy plastic bag and a pair of wire cutters. He told me how Isabella had laughed a soft and melodic sound that chilled him more than the winter air, as she whispered about the stubborn nature of an old woman who would never know what hit her. I felt a coldness spread from my chest to my fingertips, a realization dawning on me that was so monstrous I struggled to give it a name. Arthur's death, once thought to be a tragic but natural cardiac event, suddenly shifted in my mind, reconfiguring into something far more sinister. He had been a man of iron health, a mountain of a person who walked 5 miles a day and laughed with a vibrance that filled our lives, yet he had withered away in a hospital bed in a matter of days, with only Isabella at his side. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling like they were made of water, and walked to the front of the vehicle with a sense of impending doom. The latch to the hood felt heavier than usual, a gateway to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. When the metal groaned open, the smell of high-octane fuel hit me like a physical blow, pungent and volatile. Nestled deep within the intricate maze of the engine hidden beneath the air intake was a clear plastic bladder filled with a yellowish liquid positioned perfectly over the exhaust manifold. A thick ignition cable had been surgically sliced, its copper core exposed and angled so that the first spark of the engine would ignite the leaking fuel, turning my car into a high-pressure bomb. I leaned against the fender, the cold metal biting into my hip, as the world began to spin in a kaleidoscope of betrayal and grief. Isabella, the woman who had called me mother, who had sat at my table and shared our wine, had meticulously planned to erase me from the face of the earth. She wanted the Hawthorne legacy, the properties in the downtown corridor, and the vast accounts Arthur had spent 40 years building, and she wanted them without the inconvenience of a grieving widow standing in her way. I looked at Barnaby, this man whom society had cast aside, and I saw a guardian angel in rags. I reached into my purse and handed him every bill I had, not as a payment, but as a token of a debt that could never truly be settled. I told him to stay safe, to disappear into the city for a few days, and promised him that when I returned, things would be different. I called a taxi, my voice remarkably steady, despite the hurricane of emotions swirling within me, and as I watched my house recede in the rearview mirror, a new version of myself began to take shape. The mourning widow was gone, replaced by a woman of steel and shadow. A woman who understood that the only way to fight a monster was to outthink it. I arrived at the prestigious law offices of Sterling and Vane 30 minutes late, my coat damp and my eyes burning with a fire that Isabella would mistake for grief. The office was a temple of mahogany and hushed voices, a place where fortunes were dismantled and rebuilt with the stroke of a pen. Isabella was already there, draped in a black silk dress that cost more than most people made in a month, her hair perfectly coiffed and her face a masterpiece of practiced sorrow. She was sitting next to my son Caleb, her hand resting possessively on his arm, a gesture that I now saw as a mark of ownership rather than affection. Caleb looked like a ghost of himself, his eyes sunken and his shoulders slumped under the weight of losing his father, unaware that the predator was sitting right beside him. When I walked through the door, I saw a flicker of something in Isabella's eyes, a momentary fracture in her porcelain mask that lasted no longer than a heartbeat. It was shock, pure and unadulterated, a realization that I was standing before her in flesh and bone instead of being a headline in the evening news. She stood up with a theatrical grace, her voice a soft coo as she moved to embrace me, her perfume cloying and sweet, like lilies at a funeral. She whispered how worried they had been, how glad she was that I had finally arrived. Her hands cold against my back as she squeezed me with a false warmth that made my skin crawl. We sat around the heavy conference table as the lead attorney, Sebastian Vane, began to read the final codicil of Arthur's will. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the quiet scratching of a fountain pen. As Vane reached the section concerning the commercial real estate holdings, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. He announced that a modification had been made only 3 months prior to Arthur's death, a change that bypassed the primary trust and deeded the most valuable properties directly to Isabella Vance. The room fell into a stunned silence, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. I looked at the documents pushed toward me, seeing Arthur's signature at the bottom. A signature that looked nearly perfect, but lacked the slight idiosyncratic flourish he always added to the final letter of his name. I looked at Caleb, hoping to find a spark of suspicion in his eyes, but I found only a weary acceptance. He told me that Arthur had spoken of Isabella's business acumen, of his desire to secure the family's future through her vision words that sounded like they had been scripted by Isabella herself and fed to him in his moments of deepest vulnerability. I felt the floor dropping away beneath me as I realized the scale of the conspiracy. It wasn't just Isabella. It was a coordinated effort involving legal expertise and medical manipulation. I excused myself from the room, my lungs burning for air that wasn't tainted by their presence, and stood in the sterile, cold hallway of the law firm. I knew then that I couldn't simply scream the truth. I had to prove it with the kind of evidence that left no room for legal maneuvering. I returned to the room, signed the necessary papers with a steady hand, and played the part of the broken, defeated elder. I saw the triumphant glint in Isabella's eyes, a predatory satisfaction that she didn't even try to hide once she thought I was no longer a threat. She offered to drive me home, a suggestion that felt like an invitation to my own execution, but I declined, claiming I needed to walk and clear my head. As I left that office, I knew the war had officially begun, and I was going to fight it with a ruthlessness she never thought I possessed. The first person I called was Elias Thorne, a private investigator who had once worked as a high-level forensic auditor for the state. We met in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, the rain drumming a relentless rhythm against the windows. I told him everything, laying out the timeline of Arthur's illness, the anomalies in the will, and the terrifying discovery in my car. Elias listened with a stillness that was unnerving, his eyes reflecting the neon glow of the diner sign as he took notes in a small leather-bound book. He told me that Isabella wasn't a new name in his circles. He had heard whispers of a woman with a similar MO in Phoenix years ago, a woman who specialized in the quiet liquidation of wealthy estates. He promised to dig into her past to trace every cent of the money that had disappeared from Arthur's accounts, and to find the man in the tailored suit who had helped her with the car. While Elias worked in the shadows, I sought out Dr. Julian Sterling, the physician who had overseen Arthur's final days at the hospital. We met in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, the air smelling of floor wax and burnt coffee. Dr. Sterling looked haunted, his eyes tired from years of seeing life slip away. I asked him about Arthur's final hours, about the suddenness of the cardiac arrest that had claimed a man with the heart of an athlete. He hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup, before confessing that there had been inconsistencies in the blood work that he hadn't been able to explain at the time. Arthur's potassium levels had spiked to lethal levels in a matter of hours, a condition known as hyperkalemia that can cause a heart to simply stop. There was no medical reason for it, no kidney failure or medication that would have caused such a shift. And yet, because the family had opted for immediate cremation, no autopsy had been performed to investigate the possibility of external administration. He told me that Isabella had been the one to insist on the cremation, citing Arthur's supposed fear of being buried in the cold ground, a lie that cut me to the core, because Arthur had always loved the earth and the cycle of nature. The evidence was beginning to pile up, a mountain of betrayals that painted a picture of a calculated, cold-blooded murder. I spent my nights in Arthur's study, surrounded by his books and his scent, feeling his presence in the silence. I found a secret compartment in his desk, one he had never mentioned, containing bank statements from an offshore account I had never seen. Over $600,000 had been moved out of our joint assets in the 6 months leading up to his death, all of it funneled through a series of shell companies that Elias eventually traced back to a silent partner in a law firm. That partner was none other than Sebastian Vane, the very man who had read the will with such feigned solemnity. The trap was larger than I had imagined, a web of corruption that spanned from the hospital to the highest legal circles in the city. I knew that the only way to bring them all down was to force a confession to make Isabella feel so secure in her victory that she would let the truth slip through her lips. I decided to host a dinner at the Hawthorne estate, inviting Isabella and Caleb under the guise of wanting to reconcile and move forward as a family. Elias helped me prepare the house, installing high-definition cameras and microphones hidden within the ornate crown molding and the antique vases. We transformed the dining room into a digital trap. Every word spoken and every gesture made would be recorded and transmitted to a secure server miles away. I spent the day cooking Arthur's favorite meal, the scent of roasting herbs and red wine filling the house, a sensory bridge to a time when we were happy and whole. When Isabella arrived, she was glowing with the arrogance of the untouchable. She wore a diamond necklace that had belonged to Arthur's mother, a piece of jewelry she had no right to touch, much less wear. Caleb looked slightly better, perhaps relieved that the tension between his mother and his wife seemed to be dissolving. We sat at the long mahogany table, the candlelight flickering in the crystal glasses, and for the first hour, we spoke of trivial things. I played the role of the dotty, aging widow, perfectly lamenting my fading memory and my desire to just have peace in my final years. I saw Isabella relax her posture, becoming less guarded as she drank the expensive Bordeaux I had kept in the cellar for a special occasion. I began to steer the conversation toward the night Arthur died, my voice trembling with a forced fragility. I spoke of the hospital, of the strange way the light looked in his room, and how I often wondered if there was something more we could have done. Isabella patted my hand, her touch cold and clinical, as she told me that Arthur's heart had simply given out, that it was his time to go. I looked her in the eye and mentioned the blood work, the potassium levels that Dr. Sterling had mentioned, and for a split second, the mask slipped. She dismissed it as a lab error, her voice sharp and defensive, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I then moved to the car, mentioning how a mechanic had found a strange leak in the fuel line, and how lucky I was that I hadn't started the engine that morning. Isabella's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks, until she looked like the ghost she had tried to make of me. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow and brittle. I pushed further, mentioning Barnaby, the man from the streets who had seen a woman and a man tampering with my vehicle. Caleb looked from me to Isabella, a flicker of genuine confusion and dawning horror in his eyes. He asked Isabella if she knew what I was talking about, his voice, a low rumble of growing suspicion. Isabella turned on him, her voice suddenly venomous, as she told him not to listen to the ramblings of a senile woman who was losing her grip on reality. The air in the room became electric, the silence between our words heavy with the weight of the unspoken. I leaned forward, my voice no longer fragile but cold and clear like the mountain air. I told her that I knew about the bank accounts, about the forged signatures, and about the man in the tailored suit who was currently being questioned by the authorities. I saw the panic set in, then the realization that the old woman she had underestimated was the one who had built the cage around her. Isabella stood up, her eyes wide with a manic energy, and for the first time, she stopped pretending. She screamed that she deserved the money that she had spent 3 years catering to a boring, sentimental family, and that she wasn't going to let a withered widow take it all away. She boasted about how easy it had been to slip the potassium into Arthur's IV while the nurses were distracted, how he had looked at her with such trust as his heart began to falter. The confession was caught in perfect clarity, every word of her murderous intent recorded for the world to see. Caleb stood up, his face a mask of pure agony, as he realized the monster he had brought into our lives. He reached for Isabella, perhaps to stop her, or perhaps out of some lingering broken instinct to protect her. But she lashed out her fingernails, raking across his cheek as she moved toward the door. But the door didn't lead to freedom. It led to the police officers Elias had stationed in the foyer. The handcuffs clicked into place with a finality that echoed through the house, a sound of justice being served in the very place where the betrayal had begun. The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal proceedings and emotional wreckage. Sebastian Vane was arrested within the hour his office raided, and his career ended in a spectacular fall from grace. The forged will was declared null and void, and the Hawthorne estate was returned to its rightful state. But the victory felt hollow in the face of the destruction Isabella had wrought. Caleb moved back into the house, and for months we lived in a quiet truce with our grief. We walked the gardens Arthur had loved, tending to the roses, and the boxwoods, finding a slow, painful path toward healing. We spoke of him often, not of the way he died, but of the way he lived, of his kindness, and his unwavering belief in the goodness of people. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I went back to the corner where I had first met Barnaby. He was there sitting on a bench I had donated to the park, in Arthur's name, looking cleaner and more rested than I had ever seen him. I sat down beside him, the fallen leaves crunching under my boots, and we watched the children playing in the distance. I told him that the trial was over, that Isabella and Vane were behind bars where they belonged, and that the Hawthorne name had been cleared. He looked at me with the quiet wisdom and said that the truth was like the sun. You could hide from it for a while, but it would always find a way to burn through the fog. I realized then that the most profound lesson of this entire ordeal wasn't about the dangers of greed or the fragility of life. It was about the inherent dignity of the human spirit and the way we are all connected by the choices we make. Arthur had been a man who saw the value in everyone, from the titans of industry to the men who slept on the streets. And it was that very kindness that had saved my life. By treating Barnaby like a human being, Arthur had planted a seed of loyalty that had blossomed into my salvation. We are defined not by what we possess, but by the light we leave behind in others. The final days of the year arrived with a gentle snowfall that blanketed Seattle in a layer of pristine white. I stood on the porch of the Hawthorne house, looking out over the city I had lived in for nearly 50 years. Caleb was inside playing a piece on the piano that Arthur had loved, the notes drifting through the air like memories. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in a long time, a quiet certainty that we were going to be okay. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where the past was honored and the future was no longer something to be feared. I understood now that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about the restoration of balance. It's about taking the broken pieces of a life and having the courage to build something new, something stronger. I had been a woman who thought her life was over when her husband died, but I had discovered a strength within myself that was forged in the fire of betrayal. I was Eleanor Hawthorne, a woman who had fought for her truth and won, and I knew that Arthur would have been proud. As I turned to go back inside, a single white butterfly, a rare sight in the winter chill, fluttered past my face and landed on the railing. It stayed there for a moment, its wings a delicate contrast against the dark wood before taking flight into the falling snow. I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the heater inside. It was a sign, a small and beautiful reminder that even in the coldest seasons of our lives, there is still room for grace, for rebirth, and for the enduring power of a love that refuses to be extinguished by the dark. The lesson remained etched in my heart as a guiding star for the years that followed. True wealth is found in the integrity of one's soul and the depth of the compassion we extend to the world. Isabella had sought to build a throne of stolen gold, but she ended up in a cage of her own making, surrounded by the hollow echoes of her own ambition. I, on the other hand, had found a richness in the simple act of survival and the profound beauty of a family reconciled. We are all guardians of one another's stories, and when we choose to act with courage and kindness, we create a legacy that time can never erode. The snow continued to fall, a quiet benediction, over the house and the city as I closed the door on the shadows of the past and walked into the light of a new beginning. I was old, yes, and I carried the scars of a battle that had nearly claimed me, but I was alive, and I was free. And in the grand tapestry of existence, that was the only victory that truly mattered. I sat by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames reflecting in the polished wood of the room, and I picked up a book Arthur had been reading before he fell ill. I realized that while we cannot control the storms that come our way, we can always choose how we navigate through them. My journey had taught me that no one is truly invisible unless we choose not to see them, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones the world has forgotten. Barnaby Hank, Dr. Sterling. They were the pillars that held up my world when the foundations had crumbled. I vowed to spend the rest of my days honoring that truth, ensuring that the Hawthorne name stood for more than just a fortune, but for a commitment to the humanity that binds us all together in the beautiful, tragic, and ultimately triumphant experience of being alive. I reached out to the community turning the warehouse in the city into a center for the displaced, a place where people like Barnaby could find more than just a meal, but a sense of purpose and a path back to the light. Caleb joined me in this mission, finding a way to heal his own broken heart by helping others mend theirs. We worked side by side, a mother and son forged anew in the crucible of truth, proving that while betrayal can tear a family apart, the pursuit of justice and the practice of mercy can stitch it back together in a way that is even more resilient than before. In the end, the story of the Hawthorne family wasn't one of tragedy, but one of resilience. It was a testament to the fact that light is always more powerful than the dark, and that as long as we have the courage to stand for what is right, we will never truly be alone. I looked at the portrait of Arthur hanging over the mantel, his eyes kind and his smile eternal, and I whispered a final thank you to the man who had loved me enough to protect me, even from beyond the veil. The world outside was cold, but the fire within was burning bright, a flame of hope that would never be extinguished as long as there was a story to tell and a heart to listen. Would you like me to develop another chapter focused on the specific legal trial of Isabella? Or perhaps explore the backstory of Elias Thorne's investigation into her past crimes?